Welcome to Grandma's Tales, my darlings. I'm your Grandma Rose, and oh boy, do I have a story for you today that'll make your hair curl. You think you know drama? Well, sit down, sweetie, because what I'm about to tell you about your great-grandmother, Ethel, will make your jaw drop. This woman single-handedly tried to destroy my marriage before it even began. And what she did at my wedding reception still makes my blood boil 60 years later. So grab yourself a cup of tea, get comfortable, and let me tell you why I never liked your grandfather's mother. Now, before you go thinking I'm just some bitter old woman holding grudges, let me paint you a picture of exactly what kind of person Ethel Margaret Whitmore was. This was a woman who wore white gloves to the grocery store, kept plastic covers on all her furniture, even though nobody was allowed to sit on it anyway, and had opinions about everything from how you should fold your towels to what kind of soap you should use to wash your face, and heaven help you if you didn't meet her standards. I first laid eyes on this woman in the fall of 1963. Your grandfather Harold and I had been courting for about 6 months, and he'd finally worked up the nerve to take me home to meet his mother. Now Harold, bless his heart, was nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. He'd been preparing me for weeks, dropping little hints about how particular his mother was, how she had her ways of doing things, how important it was to make a good impression. "She's just protective," he'd say, wringing his hands like he was trying to squeeze water from them. "She's been alone since Dad passed, and she's got her routines. You understand?" Well, I understood all right. I understood that this woman had her grown son wrapped around her little finger, tighter than bark on a tree. But I was 22 years old and madly in love. So I figured, how hard could it be to win over one little old lady? Oh, how wrong I was. I spent 3 days getting ready for that meeting. 3 whole days. I pressed my best Sunday dress so many times I nearly wore out the fabric. Practiced my manners in the mirror. Even learned how to make her favorite cookies from Harold's sister Margaret. Snickerdoodles they were. Had to go to 3 different stores to find the right kind of cinnamon. The day finally came, and Harold picked me up in his father's old Buick. The one that smelled like pipe tobacco and Old Spice. My hands were shaking, so hard I could barely hold my purse. And Harold wasn't much better. He kept adjusting his tie and checking his hair in the rearview mirror. "Now remember," he said for the 100th time, as we pulled into the driveway of that imposing 2-story house with its perfect hedges and not a leaf out of place. "Don't sit in Dad's chair. Don't touch the china cabinet. And whatever you do, don't mention politics or that new president." The house itself should have been my first warning. Everything was so pristine, it looked like a museum display. The walkway was swept clean enough to eat off of. Every flower in the garden was standing at perfect attention, and the windows were so spotless, they practically sparkled. This wasn't a home where people lived and laughed and made messes. This was a shrine to perfection, and I was about to walk into it with my mortal, imperfect self. Harold rang the doorbell, even though it was his own childhood home, and we stood there waiting like door-to-door salesmen, hoping not to get turned away. When that door finally opened, there she was, Ethel Margaret Whitmore, in all her terrifying glory. She was a small woman, barely came up to my shoulder, but she had this way of looking at you that made you feel like you were shrinking. Her steel grey hair was pulled back so tight it looked painful, not a strand out of place. And she was wearing this black dress with a little pearl brooch at the collar. But it was her eyes that really got to you. Cold as winter morning and twice as unwelcoming, she looked me up and down like I was something she'd scrape off her shoe, taking in every detail from my carefully curled hair down to my polished Mary Janes. I was wearing my best Sunday dress, mind you, navy blue with little white flowers, pressed within an inch of its life. I'd even borrowed your Aunt Betty's pearl earrings and made sure my lipstick was perfect. So, she said, not even bothering with hello, her voice crisp as autumn leaves. You're the girl who thinks she's good enough for my Harold. Not nice to meet you, or welcome, or even, please come in. Just straight to the judgment. Harold's face went 3 shades of red, and he started stammering about how he'd told her my name was Rose, how we'd talked about this, how he was sure she was going to love me once she got to know me. Harold, she said, cutting him off with a wave of her hand like she was swatting a fly. Don't make promises you can't keep. Then she turned those icy eyes back to me. Well, I suppose you'd better come in. Wipe your feet, twice. The inside of that house was even more intimidating than the outside. Every surface gleamed like it had been polished that morning. Probably because it had. The furniture looked like it belonged in a magazine, all perfectly arranged with little doilies and trinkets that screamed, "Look but don't touch." There were antimacassars on every chair, plastic runners on the carpet in the high-traffic areas, and I swear I saw her flinch when my coat brushed against the wall. As Harold helped me out of it, she led us into the parlour, and I use that word specifically because that's what she called it. Not the living room or the front room, but the parlour, like we were living in some Victorian novel. She gestured for me to sit in this delicate-looking chair that I was terrified I might break just by breathing on it, while Harold perched nervously on the edge of the sofa, like he was ready to bolt at any moment. "Tea?" she asked, though it sounded more like an order than an offer. Before I could answer, she was already heading toward the kitchen, calling back over her shoulder, "Harold, you know where the good china is. Get it down and try not to chip anything this time." Poor Harold jumped up like he'd been shot, whispering to me as he passed, "Just agree with everything she says. And for the love of all that's holy, don't spill anything." While they were clattering around in the kitchen, I took the opportunity to look around the room. Everything was exactly as I'd imagined it would be. Dark, heavy furniture that looked like it weighed more than a car. Photographs in silver frames showing stern-faced relatives who all seemed to be glaring directly at me. A grandfather clock that ticked so loudly it sounded like a heartbeat. And over the mantelpiece, a portrait of Harold's late father, painted in oils and looking down at the room with the same judgmental expression his wife wore. But what really caught my attention was the shrine she'd built to Harold on the side table. Baby pictures, school photos, his high school graduation picture, even a lock of his baby hair in a little silver locket. It was like she'd created a museum dedicated to her son, and I got the distinct feeling she didn't want anyone else joining the exhibit. They came back with the tea service, and let me tell you, it was a production. Real china cups so thin, you could see through them. Little silver spoons that probably cost more than my weekly salary, and enough sugar cubes to build a small castle. Ethel poured with the precision of a surgeon, her movements so calculated and careful you'd think she was performing brain surgery. Instead of making tea, "Sugar?" she asked, holding the tongs over the sugar bowl. "Just one, please," I said, trying to match her formal tone. She dropped in exactly 1 cube. No more, no less, and handed me the cup, with a look that suggested she was waiting for me to prove what a clumsy oaf I was by dropping it immediately. I took it with both hands, determined not to give her the satisfaction, and managed to take a sip without incident. The tea was perfect, of course. Hot but not scalding, strong but not bitter. I should have complimented it, should have said something nice about the china, or the lovely way she'd arranged the cookies on the plate. Instead, I sat there like a nervous ninny, trying not to rattle the cup against the saucer every time I took a sip. So, Rose, she said, settling back in her chair, like a queen on her throne, tell me about your family. This was the moment I'd been dreading. My family was perfectly respectable, mind you, but we weren't what you'd call fancy. My father worked at the steel mill. My mother took in sewing to help make ends meet. We lived in a modest house on the wrong side of town, and while we always had enough to eat and clean clothes on our backs, we certainly didn't have China tea services or oil paintings hanging on our walls. Well, I began, setting my cup down carefully. My father works at Bethlehem Steel, and my mother does alterations and mending for the ladies in town. I have 2 younger brothers, Tommy and James, and we all live together on Maple Street. I watched her face as I spoke, saw the little tightening around her eyes when I mentioned the steel mill, the way her lips pursed slightly at the mention of my mother taking in sewing. It was like she was filing away each piece of information to use against me later. "And what do you do for work?" she continued, though her tone suggested she already knew she wasn't going to approve of whatever I said. "I'm a secretary at Miller's Insurance Company," I replied, trying to inject some pride into my voice. It was a good job, respectable work, and I was proud of what I did, but I could see from her expression that she found it lacking. "Secretarial work," she repeated, like she was tasting something bitter. "How practical." The way she said practical made it sound like the worst insult she could think of. Harold jumped in then, bless his heart, trying to salvage the situation. "Rose is the best secretary Mr. Miller's ever had," he said, his voice getting higher with nervousness. "She keeps the whole office running smooth as silk. Why, he says he doesn't know what he'd do without her." Ethel turned that cold stare on. Her son. "Harold dear, I wasn't asking you." The poor man shrank back into the sofa cushions, like a scolded child. It was painful to watch, this grown man being reduced to a nervous boy by his mother's disapproval. But it was also my first real glimpse of what I'd be dealing with if I married into this family. "And what are your intentions regarding my son?" she asked, turning back to me with the directness of a firing squad. I nearly choked on my tea. What kind of question was that to ask a girl on their first meeting? I looked over at Harold for help, but he was staring at his hands like they held the secrets of the universe. That is, Harold and I are, I stammered, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. "Ah, what, dear?" she pressed, leaning forward slightly, like a cat about to pounce on a mouse. "We care for each other very much." I finally managed to get out. "Care for each other," she repeated, the same way she'd said practical earlier. How sweetly vague. The conversation continued in this painful fashion for another hour. She asked about my cooking skills, my housekeeping abilities, my religious beliefs, and my thoughts on child rearing. Each answer I gave seemed to disappoint her more than the last. When I mentioned that my mother had taught me to cook, but that I was still learning some of the finer points, she made a little tisk sound under her breath. When I said I attended church regularly, but at the Methodist church instead of her Presbyterian one, she raised an eyebrow like I'd just admitted to devil worship. But the real kicker came when she started talking about Harold's future. She had it all planned out, you see. He was going to take over his father's hardware store, continue living in the family home, to take care of her in her old age, and eventually marry a nice girl from a good family who would understand the importance of tradition and keeping up appearances. "Of course," she said, looking directly at me. "Any girl who marries Harold would need to understand that family comes first. His responsibilities to his mother and the family business would have to take precedence over any romantic notions she might have." I felt something cold settle in the pit of my stomach. as I realized what she was really saying. She wasn't just interviewing me as a potential daughter-in-law. She was laying down the law, making it clear that if I wanted to be part of this family, I would always come second to her wishes and expectations. The visit finally ended when she announced that it was time for Harold to drive her to her ladies' auxiliary meeting at the church. She walked us to the door, her back straight as a ruler, and watched as Harold helped me into my coat. "Thank you for the tea, Mrs. Whitmore," I said, trying to be polite despite feeling like I'd just survived a brutal interrogation. Was all she said in response. But the look she gave me spoke volumes. It said she'd found me wanting in every possible way, and she was going to make sure Harold knew it. As we drove away from that house, Harold was practically bouncing in his seat with nervous energy. "Well," he asked, "what did you think?" "She liked you. I could tell. She used the good china, and she never uses the good china unless she really likes someone." I stared at him in amazement. Had we been in the same room for the past 2 hours? His mother had done everything short of outright telling me I wasn't good enough for her precious son, and he thought she liked me. "Harold," I said carefully, "I'm not sure your mother approves of me." "Oh, don't worry about that," he said, waving off my concerns like they were gnats buzzing around his head. "Mother's like that with everyone at first. She just needs time to warm up to you. You'll see, once she gets to know you better, you two will be thick as thieves." I didn't have the heart to tell him that I doubted his mother would ever warm up to anyone who threatened her position as the most important woman in his life. But I loved Harold, truly loved him, and I was determined to make this work somehow. Over the next few months, I tried everything I could think of to win Ethel over. I brought her homemade bread, offered to help with her spring cleaning, even volunteered to type up the minutes for her ladies' auxiliary meetings. Every gesture was met with polite thanks and thinly veiled criticism. The bread was too dense. She had her own way of cleaning that she preferred not to change, and my typing, while neat, wasn't quite up to her exacting standards. But I kept trying, because Harold was worth it. We got engaged that spring, and he was over the moon with happiness. He'd saved up for months to buy me a beautiful little diamond ring, and when he proposed in the park, where we'd had our first picnic, I thought my heart might burst with joy. His mother's reaction to our engagement was about what you'd expect. She smiled and said all the right things when Harold told her, but there was ice in her eyes and steel in her voice. She immediately began planning the wedding with military precision, making it clear that this was going to be done her way or not at all. "Now, Rose dear," she said during one of our wedding planning sessions, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I know young girls have all sorts of romantic ideas about their weddings, but we must be practical. The family has certain standards to maintain, and we can't have anything that might seem inappropriate." What she meant was that she'd already decided on everything from the flowers to the music to the guest list, and my job was to smile and agree with whatever she'd chosen. When I timidly suggested that maybe we could have the reception at the American Legion Hall where my parents had gotten married, she looked at me like I'd suggested holding it in a barn. "Oh, my dear, no," she said with a little laugh that had no warmth in it. "That simply wouldn't do at all. We'll have it at the country club, of course. It's where all the Whitmore family celebrations have been held for generations." When I pointed out that the country club would cost more than my father made in 3 months, she waved that concern away like it was nothing. "Harold's inheritance. We'll cover it, naturally. After all, this is a Whitmore wedding, and we must do things properly." I should have spoken up then. I should have insisted that my family's wishes be considered, that maybe we could find some middle ground that would make everyone happy. But I was young and in love, and desperate to keep the peace. So I bit my tongue and let her have her way. The dress shopping was another nightmare entirely. Ethel had very definite ideas about what constituted an appropriate wedding gown, and none of them matched what I'd dreamed of wearing on my special day. She dragged me to 3 different shops, vetoing everything I showed even the slightest interest in. Too much lace, she'd say, or too low in the neckline, or too modern looking. Finally, she settled on a dress that looked like something from the 1940s, with long sleeves, a high neckline, and enough fabric to upholster a small sofa. It was beautiful in its way, I suppose, but it wasn't me. It was her vision of what a proper Whitmore bride should look like. The final straw should have been when she insisted on rewriting my wedding vows. I'd spent weeks crafting something personal and meaningful, something that captured how Harold and I felt about each other and the life we wanted to build together. But when she saw what I'd written, she shook her head like I'd handed her a grocery list. "Oh dear, this won't do at all," she said, pulling out a piece of paper from her purse. "I've taken the liberty of writing something more appropriate. Traditional. Vows are always best, don't you think? All this modern nonsense about partnerships and equality is just that, nonsense. A wife's duty is to honor and obey her husband, and through him, his family." I stared at the vows she'd written, full of words like submit and serve and defer to the wisdom of. They made marriage sound like a prison sentence rather than a celebration of love. But when I looked over at Harold, he was nodding along like this all made perfect sense. "Mother knows best about these things," he said, and I realized that this was going to be my life, not just dealing with Ethel's interference, but with Harold's complete inability to stand up to her. The wedding day itself started out beautiful. June 15th, 1964, dawned clear and bright, with just enough of a breeze to keep it from being too hot. I woke up in my childhood bedroom for the last time, surrounded by my sisters and cousins who'd come to help me get ready. For a few hours, I forgot about all the stress and drama and just enjoyed being a bride. My mother helped me into that massive wedding dress, and even though it wasn't what I would have chosen, I had to admit I looked beautiful. The veil had been in my family for 3 generations, and wearing it made me feel connected to all the women who'd come before me. My father cried when he saw me, and my little brothers actually behaved themselves for once. The ceremony at the church went off without a hitch. Harold looked so handsome in his new suit, and when he saw me walking down the aisle, his face just lit up with joy. For those few minutes, standing at the altar and promising to love each other forever, it was just the 2 of us and nothing else mattered. But then came the reception, and that's when Ethel really showed her true colors. Everything had been arranged, exactly as she'd wanted it. The country club ballroom was decorated with white roses and baby's breath. The band was playing sedate waltz music, and the guests were seated at tables, covered with her best china and crystal. It should have been perfect, and for the first hour or so, it was. Harold and I had our first dance to "The Way You Look Tonight," and I felt like I was floating on air. My parents looked so proud, and even some of Ethel's stuffier friends were smiling and seemed to be enjoying themselves. I started to think that maybe, just maybe, we'd gotten through the worst of it. Then came time to cut the cake. Now, I should probably mention that this wasn't just any cake. This was a masterpiece from Muller's Bakery. 3 tiers of vanilla, sponge with buttercream roses, and real sugarwork decorations. It had cost more than my mother spent on groceries in 2 months, and it was absolutely beautiful. Harold and I posed for pictures, made the traditional first cut together, and I even managed not to smash any cake in his face despite his teasing. That's when Ethel made her move. She came sweeping over in her navy blue mother of the groom dress, smiling that cold smile of hers, and announced that she wanted to make a speech. Before anyone could stop her, she was tapping her champagne glass with a knife and calling for everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "I want to thank you all for being here to celebrate this special day with our family." Notice she said, "our family," not both our families. My parents and relatives were apparently just guests at this Whitmore family production. "Harold has always been such a special boy," she continued, looking lovingly at her son, who was beginning to look uncomfortable with all the attention. "So devoted to his family, so respectful of tradition. I've always known that when he chose a wife, she would have to be someone very special indeed. Here it comes." I thought, this is where she says something nice about me and welcomes me to the family. And while Rose may not be exactly what I would have chosen for my son, she went on, and I felt my stomach drop to my shoes. "I'm sure she'll learn to fit in with our ways in time." The room went dead silent. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears and see my mother's face turning red with indignation. Harold was staring at his mother with his mouth hanging open, finally beginning to realize just how cruel she was being. But Ethel wasn't finished. "Of course, it will be an adjustment for everyone," she continued, with that same pleasant smile, like she was discussing the weather instead of publicly humiliating her new daughter-in-law. "Harold is used to a certain standard of living, certain expectations, but I'm confident that with the right guidance, Rose will learn to maintain the Whitmore family reputation." She raised her champagne glass then, as if she'd just given the most heartwarming toast in the world. "To the happy couple," she said. "May they have a long and educational marriage." The scattered applause that followed was the most awkward sound I've ever heard. People didn't know whether to clap or pretend they hadn't heard what she just said. My father looked like he wanted to punch something, and my poor mother was dabbing at her eyes with her handkerchief. But the worst part was Harold's reaction. Instead of standing up for me, instead of telling his mother that her behavior was unacceptable, he just sat there looking embarrassed and uncomfortable. When I looked at him with tears in my eyes, he couldn't even meet my gaze. That night, in our honeymoon suite at the Grandview Hotel, I finally broke down and cried. All the stress and humiliation and disappointment came pouring out, and I sobbed until I thought I might be sick. Harold tried to comfort me, tried to explain that his mother didn't mean anything by what she'd said, that she was just nervous about losing him. She insulted me in front of everyone we know, I told him through my tears. She made it clear that she doesn't think I'm good enough for you, and you just sat there and let her do it. She's set in her ways, he said weakly. You have to understand, she's been the only woman in my life for so long. This is hard for her too. What about me? I asked. What about how hard this is for me? I'm your wife now, Harold. Doesn't that mean anything? He promised things would get better. He promised he'd talk to his mother, set some boundaries, make sure she treated me with respect. And I wanted to believe him so badly that I convinced myself he meant it. But of course, things didn't get better. If anything, they got worse. We moved into a little apartment above the hardware store, and Ethel made it her business to drop by at least 3 times a week, always finding something to criticize. The way I'd arranged the furniture wasn't quite right. My cooking needed improvement. I wasn't keeping Harold's shirts pressed to her standards. Nothing I did was ever good enough, and Harold never once told her to back off. She'd show up unannounced with casseroles and cleaning supplies, making it clear that she didn't trust me to take proper care of her son. She'd rearrange my kitchen, cabinets when I wasn't looking, then act surprised when I couldn't find anything. She'd critique the way I did the laundry, the way I made the bed, even the way I answered the telephone. Harold prefers his eggs over easy, not scrambled, she'd say, watching me cook breakfast in my own kitchen. And that coffee is much too weak. A man needs strong coffee to start his day properly. When I got pregnant with your father, I thought maybe things would change. Surely becoming a grandmother would soften her up, make her see me as more than just the woman who'd stolen her precious son. I was so naive. Instead, she became even more intrusive, if that was possible. She had opinions about everything from what I should eat during pregnancy to what names we should consider for the baby. She insisted on coming to my doctor's appointments, sitting right there in the examining room, like she had every right to be there. I raised Harold perfectly well, she'd tell Dr. Peterson, and I intend to make sure this baby gets the same quality, care. She even had the nerve to suggest that maybe I should move back in with her during the last month of my pregnancy, just to make sure everything went smoothly. When I politely declined, she sniffed and said something about young mothers these days, not appreciating good advice when it was offered. The day your father was born was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life, and it was mostly. Little Robert came into the world, healthy and beautiful, with Harold's dark hair and what I hoped were my eyes. Harold was so proud he could barely contain himself. And for a few precious hours, it was just the three of us bonding as a new family. Then Ethel arrived. She burst into that hospital room like she owned the place, pushing past the nurses and announcing that she was there to see her grandson. Never mind that I was exhausted and sore and barely decent in my hospital gown. Never mind that visiting hours weren't even officially started yet. She had decided it was time to meet the baby, and what Ethel wanted, Ethel got. She scooped little Robert right out of my arms, without so much as asking permission, cooing over him like he was her own personal possession. "Oh, look at this beautiful boy," she said, not even glancing in my direction. "He looks just like Harold did at this age. The same nose, the same chin, a true Whitmore through and through." I wanted to point out that he also had my mouth and my grandmother's delicate hands, but I was too tired to fight. Besides, I told myself she was just excited to be a grandmother. Surely this would be the thing that finally brought us together. But even this blessing became another source of conflict. Ethel immediately appointed herself the expert on all things baby-related, despite the fact that it had been 30 years since she had had an infant to care for. She criticized everything, from the way I held him to the brand of diapers I preferred. "Cloth diapers," she declared, when she saw the disposable ones I'd bought. "Babies should be in cloth diapers, the way nature intended. All these modern conveniences are just making mothers lazy." When I pointed out that disposable diapers were more sanitary and convenient, especially for a working mother, she gave me that look she'd perfected over the years. "Working mother," she said, like the words tasted bad in her mouth. "Surely you're not planning to go back to that job, now that you have a baby to care for." The truth was, I needed to work. Harold's salary from the hardware store wasn't enough to support all three of us, especially with the baby's expenses added to our budget. But Ethel couldn't understand that. In her world, wives stayed home and devoted themselves entirely to their families, regardless of financial reality. "If Harold isn't making enough money to support his family properly," she said, with that sniff she'd perfected, "then perhaps he needs to work harder at the store. I'm sure there are ways to increase the business if he applies himself." What she didn't mention was that she still controlled the purse strings of the business, doling out Harold's salary like an allowance and making sure he never had enough independence to truly provide for his own family. It was all part of her master plan to keep him dependent on her, and by extension, to keep me in my place. The breaking point came when little Robert was about 6 months old. I'd gone back to work part-time at the insurance office, leaving the baby with Mrs. Patterson next door during the day. It was a good arrangement that worked for everyone involved, or so I thought. I came home one afternoon to find Ethel in my living room, holding Robert and looking at me with that disapproving expression I'd come to know so well. "Rose, dear," she said, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "We need to have a little talk." I set down my purse and coat, trying to prepare myself for whatever criticism was coming this time. Had I left dishes in the sink? Was the baby's outfit not up to her standards? Had she found dust somewhere that proved I was a neglectful housekeeper? "I've been thinking about this childcare situation," she continued, rocking Robert gently in her arms, "and I really don't think it's working out." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew where this was headed. "Well, Mrs. Patterson is a lovely woman, I'm sure, but she's not family. She doesn't understand the importance of maintaining proper standards, of raising a child with the right values. And frankly, I'm not comfortable with my grandson spending so much time with strangers." I felt my temper starting to rise. "Mrs. Patterson isn't a stranger. She's our neighbor. She raised 4 children of her own, and she's wonderful with Robert. I'm sure she means well," Ethel said with that patronizing tone that made me want to scream. But good intentions aren't enough when it comes to child rearing. A baby needs consistency, structure, the kind of care that only family can provide. "And what exactly are you suggesting?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I didn't want to hear the answer. "I'm suggesting that I take care of Robert during the day while you're at work. I have plenty of experience, plenty of time, and most importantly, I have a vested interest in making sure he's raised properly." The very idea made my blood run cold. The thought of leaving my precious baby in the care of this woman who'd made my life miserable for the past 2 years was absolutely unthinkable. But I could see from the way she was holding him, the possessive look in her eyes, that she'd already made up her mind. "I appreciate the offer," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable, "but I'm happy with the current arrangement. Mrs. Patterson is doing a wonderful job, and Robert seems very comfortable with her." Ethel's expression hardened. "I wasn't really making a suggestion, dear. I've already spoken to Harold about this, and he agrees that family care is best for the baby." Of course she had. Of course she'd gone to Harold behind my back and gotten his agreement before even bothering to discuss it with me. It was the pattern that had been established from the very beginning of our marriage, with me always being the last to know about decisions that affected my own life. "Where is Harold?" I asked, looking around the apartment like he might be hiding behind the furniture. "He's down at the store, dealing with some supplier issues. But he wanted me to tell you that he thinks this arrangement makes perfect sense. After all, why pay a stranger to watch the baby when family is willing to do it for free?" Free. That was the key word, wasn't it? Harold saw this as a way to save money, not realizing the true cost of putting our son under his mother's complete control for 8 hours a day. That night, when Harold came home from work, I tried to talk to him about it. I explained my concerns, my worries about what kind of influence his mother might have on Robert, my need to maintain some control over my own child's care. "Don't you think you're being a little unreasonable?" he asked, loosening his tie and settling into his favorite chair like this was just another minor household dispute. "Mother raised me just fine, and she's offering to help us out. We'd save money, and Robert would be with family. What's wrong with that?" "What's wrong is that your mother doesn't respect me as Robert's mother," I said, trying to make him understand. She undermines everything I do, criticizes every decision I make. How is she going to be with my son when I'm not there to defend myself? Harold sighed the way he always did when he didn't want to deal with conflict. She means well, Rose. She's just trying to help. She doesn't mean well, Harold. She means to control. She wants to raise Robert the way she raised you. And look how that turned out. That got his attention, but not in a good way. What's that supposed to mean? It means you're 35 years old, and you still can't make a decision without checking with your mother first. It means you've never once stood up for me, or our marriage when she's been inappropriate. It means you care more about keeping her happy than protecting your own family. The fight that followed was the worst we'd ever had. Harold accused me of being jealous of his mother, of trying to drive a wedge between them. I accused him of being a coward who'd rather sacrifice his wife's happiness than deal with his mother's disapproval.